Hey everybody, welcome back. Yes, the AC is running, and it's gonna run. It's another hot day down here in Texas. So you guys are starting to get even with me for all those times when it's freezing cold up there and I've said, oh, it's nice out here. Whew. Yesterday got to 109. And this morning I was out training at the track before the sun popped up, trying to get some training in before it got too hot, and it was still really hot. So there's that noise going on in the background. Today we're going to look at two different speakers. Now these speakers came in independently. You viewers, you just send stuff into us and we look at it, work on whatever comes in. In this case, there's a Klipsch speaker and another speaker from Monoprice, another one of their Monolith series. And these are both center channels, and they're both about the same price point, pretty close. And I thought, let's just look at these two things together, and let's compare what showed up, and then we'll talk about what I'm going to be able to do with these things as far as doing some upgrades. Because that's why these things get sent in. They get sent in because people have purchased it. They're either unhappy with the way it sounds, or they just want to play with it and they want to take it up another notch. So they send it to me. Now, Klipsch model is the 404C center channel, and we're looking at the Monolith THX-365 center channel. First, let's look at the Klipsch model, and I don't have a lot of room up here on the table for everything, so I've got the cabinet right here, and we're going to pick this thing up and take a look at it. This is another one of their 4-woofer center channels. It's very lightly constructed. This doesn't weigh very much. There's a brace right here, and then this whole center part is a big resonance chamber here. At some point, I'm going to order some of those little electric football players that I used to play with when I was a kid. When you had a little electric football set, and you set everything up, and you turned it on, and it went bzzz, and the players just all ran across the field as it vibrates. I'm going to get me some of those, because we've had a lot of speakers in lately that I thought, man, if I set one of those players on top of this speaker and hit it with a test tone at 80 hertz or 130 hertz or whatever it was that excited the panel, that little player would just run across the top of the speaker like it's a little football field. And in this case, this Klipsch speaker may be in that category. I know many of the Klipsch speakers are, because they come in completely unbraced. This one does have some bracing. It also does have the acoustic centers that are spaced a little further apart. So yeah, you go left or right, and it's going to fall apart. That's just the way it works. Now the tweeter in this one, it is one of their little horn-loaded tweeters, but not much of a horn. I mean, it's got this nifty little rubber piece that goes on it that makes it very decorative and also allows you to peel it off so you can work on it. At this point, there's not much horn left, so why not use a good dome tweeter in these things? And then it has 4 of these little woofers that are the spun aluminum stamped steel frame ringing drivers that I just shake my head at. One big port in the back. The drivers have these little beauty rings that snap onto them, and it makes it look very decorative. To take these things off, you just go around the inside of it and pop these out, and then you can actually unscrew all the screws to remove the woofers. Stuff on the back, your standard binding posts, like you normally see on the Klipsch stuff. Not only are there steel nuts on the back of it, but the whole terminal end is steel. So, boo, Klipsch, you did a horrible job on that part there. And then there's the crossover. You know what? Let's hold on that one, the old crossover, before we analyze this big slice of cheese. Let's look at the Monolith THX-365. Oh yeah, and the Klipsch does have a magnetically held on grill that snaps on that does look very nice. Okay, this one it's got a little pad on the bottom there that it sits on, and it's very lightly constructed, very much like the Klipsch. It has one brace in the center, so we got some pretty hollow areas on both ends. I'm guessing 19 millimeter to 9/16 inch thick MDF on this one. Not a lot. It again has the dome mid and dome tweeter pod that fits in the center of it, and it does have the heavy paper cone woofers that they're really heavy for a little woofer, but again, for these applications where it's not having to play up so high, maybe not that big a deal. It's got a nice little binding post plate on the back of it. It does not have steel terminals, but it does have steel screws on the back of it. So, boo to you guys as well on that one. Let's look at the quality of the crossover on these things. Oh, and these have a nice magnetically held on grill as well. Crossover is pretty similar on these things. They're both kind of cheesy, but at least this one, the Monolith, does have all poly caps and some little air core inductors on the tweeter mid. So kudos to them for that. It's still got iron core inductors, electrolytic caps and sand cast resistors on the woofers, and it does have a resistor in the signal path directly to the woofers. We'll get to that in a minute. That was stupid. The Klipsch stuff, it has little polyester based caps on it. It has some air core inductors on the tweeter. It has the iron core inductors on the woofers. Again, electrolytic caps and sand cast resistors, pretty much what you'd expect at these price points. There's no budget left for them to spend any kind of money on this stuff. They're trying to make it as cheaply as possible. Now, price-wise on these things, the Klipsch, I looked this up, retailed for $349. The Monolith speaker retailed for $499, so a little more expensive, and there were some open box versions at $399. So similar price, and I know Klipsch has some other center channels that are a little bit bigger that are also in the same price point, which suffer from some of the same issues that this model does. Let's talk about the Klipsch stuff for a moment, though. The crossovers that I've noticed on this entire product line may have been just designed electrically, calculated, throw them on and out the door. The whole product line had major issues. There were some breakups, some ringing issues in quite a few of them, but the biggie was that the drivers were out of phase, and it was out of phase on everyone across the whole product line. And that's where the woofers play up to a certain point, and then the tweeter plays to a certain point, and usually they fall into each other, and then they sum to make a flat response. These don't sum. The frequency response follows the contour of those because they're about 90 degrees out of phase or so. And it was like that across the product line. So we would go in and fix it. We'd go in and design crossovers that shift phase and keep them in phase over the range so that it's a nice, smooth, balanced response. And I've had a lot of guys say, "Oh, but that's the house sound. That's what the way they wanted it because it's going to sound better that way." And no, it's never going to sound better when drivers are not in phase. And in fact, they've come out with the V2 versions of almost every one of these products. And they've gone in and they've redesigned the crossovers, and they've done away with that problem. They've designed a crossover that would keep the drivers in phase so there's no big holes in the response. And it's on a lot of all the V2 models that have come in compared to the version 1 models all have that correction. So I'm not the only one pointing it out saying, hey, this is a problem. Klipsch has gone back and addressed it, and they've redesigned it. So still same cheesy parts, but they fixed that. So if you're in the market for some of these and you're looking at maybe some of the used older models or the newer model, definitely the newer models have a more accurate response. They're still lined with the same quality of parts. You don't expect a high-end sound out of a budget speaker, but they have addressed that issue. Now, the Monolith speakers, whoever did the engineering on this thing did a good job. I've said that in the last 2 videos where we did their towers and their stand-mounted ones with the THX drivers, the up-firing Atmos drivers in the top of them. And I gave them a little praise. They did a really good job on some of those. And the feedback that I got in on those videos was very consistent in one regard. And I want to say up front, just because I said they did a really good job with the design work on this does not mean I'm endorsing the company's products. I had a lot of people come in and say, hey, we've had major customer service issues with this company, and it was a lot. And they may indeed have had those issues. Again, I'm just going over what showed up and the quality of what was done, and I'm giving you some feedback on it. I'm not endorsing the company in any way. So you guys don't get upset with me when I say something was really good when you've had a bad experience with them, or I say something's really bad when you think you've had a good experience with them. I'm just giving you my feedback on it and my evaluation that I give these customers when they send these products to me before I do anything to it. Now, the Klipsch stuff, obviously I'm going to have to go in and design a whole new crossover for this thing to fix those problems and to fix the phase issue. With the Monolith, I'm not going to have to redesign anything. They did a pretty good job on the design work, with one exception, and that's that they have an issue where the woofers are playing louder than the tweeter in the mid, and they have an issue where the impedance has gotten really low. This impedance would be down to 2.9 ohms, 2.6 ohms, somewhere in that range. Actually, it's going to be lower than that. Let me get my glasses out. It's at a minimum of 3.3 ohms. If it wasn't for the 1 ohm resistor, it'd actually be at 2.3 ohms. So they've got a problem where the impedance is too low, so they thought, I'll solve it and just put a 1 ohm resistor in there and we'll bring it up to 3.3 ohms. Dumb idea. For one, you're limiting power handling, because eventually, if you're hitting it with a lot of low frequency information, that resistor is going to have to dissipate a lot of power, and it's probably going to burn up. And then when it does, the woofers are going to quit playing altogether. At least they used a 25 watt rated resistor, but why in the world would you want to put a 25 watt resistor directly in line with the woofers? That makes no sense at all. What they should have done is they should have just raised the impedance of the woofers. They should have made a DCR on these woofers at about 12 to 14 ohms. That way the actual minimum impedance dip would be 6 to 7 ohms. It would be easy to drive, and at the same time it would lower the output and balance out the output level with the mid and tweeter, and it would have been an easy fix, and you wouldn't have had a resistor in the signal path, and you wouldn't have had to buy the extra parts of putting a resistor in the signal path to bring this down. So kind of dumb in that regard. But as far as the rest of the work, they did a pretty good job. And the way I want to look at this is I want to throw up the frequency response of the Klipsch and the frequency response of the Monolith. Let's do it like this. We'll do the Klipsch 404C and then the Monolith THX-365 center right below it. So as you can see, the frequency response is a lot smoother in the Monolith. And let's look at the grill effects. Both of these have pretty decent grills, and there is some negative effects, but not huge. The Klipsch speaker and then the Monolith below it. And still, the Monolith is by far a smoother response, and they both are better off without the grills. The grills have negative effects on both of them, and this one has little standoffs on it, so it's not even getting flush against the baffle. So this is being stood off on it, and they rounded the wrong side of this thing, which is kind of funny. They rounded the inside edge that goes up against the woofer. What they needed to do is round the outside edge, because the sound is reflecting off of that sharp edge, and it's causing these discrepancies here in the frequency response. It's causing these anomalies here and making it a rough response, and that's a lot of it's just due to these surface reflections. They should have rounded the outside or the inside edges so it kind of flares like this instead of it being sharp. And we want it like this instead of like this, in other words. So why would they do that backwards? And it could be they glued the fabric on the wrong side. I don't know, but they have the flare on the wrong side. So that's why you see a little more there. Looking at the vertical off axis on this, let's look at the Klipsch and we look at the Monolith, and when we've got a speaker there on its side and we're going up and down, we're not changing the time arrival of the drivers too much. We're just looking at the off axis. And in this case, they both look pretty good in relation to the on axis response. We're not seeing any changes there. The Klipsch still looks really rough because it's got that really rough response. The tweeter is 4 or 5 dB hotter than the woofer level down low, and it's a mess. But let's look at the horizontal off axis, and this is what's important when you're looking at a center channel. You want to look at how wide of a seating area do I have that still contains a really good on-axis response. Obviously, if you're sitting on a couch, if you move over one seat, you don't want the sound to change. If you move over to some side chair or something that's way off axis, you don't want it to completely collapse and fall away. It's not going to sound right. So let's look at the Klipsch, and let's look at the Monolith. And as you can see on the Klipsch, because of the acoustic centers being so far apart, it's kind of a disaster when you get off axis. Of course, it's hard to say where it really gets to a point where it's acceptable because the on-axis response isn't acceptable. But 10 degrees off axis isn't a big change. 20 is fair. 30 degrees, it's completely a mess. Whereas with the Monolith, down in the range where that mid is playing, you see it hump up a little bit in the off axis. But overall, you're not seeing huge changes. Remember, these scales are 5 dB scales, so we're not talking massive change, but we're talking a little bit of change there. It's a little rougher. 10 degrees off axis looks great. 20 looks still really good. It isn't until you get 30 or 40 degrees off axis that you really see that hump come up there at 11 or 1200 hertz, and that's where it's got that big peak. Let's look at the spectral decay. If we look at the Klipsch, we see there's a couple of lines there where there's some stored energy. We see it at the bottom of the tweeter's range, and at the top of the woofer's range we see some ringing right there, and we see that hole in the response. We look at the Monolith, we see everything drops off really quickly, but the woofers, because they are so heavy, you see the woofers taking longer to bleed off that stored energy, which is going to give it a little bloom down in the vocal region. It's not going to be fast and tight and clean. It's going to be a little more boomy sounding. So that's why you see, compared to the little woofers on the Klipsch, you see them drop off stored energy pretty quickly, except for where it's ringing and breaking up. Whereas these woofers, you see it hold it for a little longer. Then let's get to the impedance response. The Klipsch drops to 3.7 ohms minimum impedance. Let's look at it here. And then the Monolith, it drops to 3.3 ohms, which is pretty bad, and it would be a lot worse even without that resistor in the path. It would drop, like I said, to 2.3 ohms. Yeah, I already talked about how they could have fixed that in a better way. Let's talk about how your amplifier reacts to these impedance loads. And let's look at them again. Let's look at the Klipsch load, and it's a 3.7 minimum impedance load down at the woofer end, but at the tweeter end, it's way up there around 10 ohms. Now, what happens when you have a mismatch like that? When you have an impedance that's, 5 or 6 ohms different, your amplifier sees that load differently. A solid-state amp will tend to double output as impedance halves. A lot of tube amps won't do that at all. So what you see when you hook it up to a solid-state amp is, with the Klipsch speakers, it's going to drive the woofers harder and the tweeters not as hard. And then when you go to a tube amp, it's going to be completely different. So if you put this on a tube amp, the tweeter level may be hotter, even more so than the woofer level. So it's an impedance mismatch there. Whereas over here with the Monolith, the impedance is pretty balanced. We're not seeing a big change in impedance. So from one receiver to the next amp to the next thing, it's going to maintain the same output relative to whatever you're powering it with. It's not going to change drastically depending on what you're playing it with. The other thing I want to point out with these impedances is it is stupid to produce home theater stuff like this and produce center channels with the impedances this low. I can tell you right now, in this application, 90-something% of the time it's going to be hooked up to a receiver. Even if it's a good receiver, that receiver has one power supply in there to feed power to all the channels driven. So you may have a center channel, a left and a right pair, at bare minimum. Then you may have surrounds, or you may have multiple surrounds. And that one power supply is having to deliver current to all of those things. And when you start ganging up 4-ohm speakers on a lot of those receivers, they're not going to like it. They're not going to like it at all. In fact, it's going to run hot, overheat, or it's going to want to shut down. Even if you look at the specs on a lot of those receivers, it may say 4 ohms at this much power, 8 ohms all channels driven, this much power. In other words, you can't drive all channels as a 4-ohm load. Why you would want the center channel to be a 4-ohm load, that does not make any sense at all. But that's what these are. So keep in mind, when you start buying speakers for your home theater system, or you're looking at these things, make sure that you're not going to overload your receiver or really tax it. You know, that's why almost all of our center channels that we do, in fact, every center channel we do, they're all 8-ohm speakers. We'll use a pair of 16-ohm woofers in parallel so that you're right back to an easy 8-ohm load. So your amplification isn't overdriven. So we do that across the board. I always like to make speakers where the impedance is fairly balanced so that there's no big shifts in impedance. Or I try to make sure that it's a high enough impedance load that you can drive it with anything. Now, again, just keep that in mind if you're out there looking at speakers and you're not a DIY guy, you don't want to build one of our kits, you just want to buy something at Best Buy. Look at the impedances on these things. Now, the Klipsch model, obviously, I'm going to have to go in and redesign something completely new to fix this mess. The Monolith, what we're going to do with it is the same thing we've done with the other models, is we're just going to replicate their crossover because they did a pretty good job other than that. And I'm going to up this to 4 resistors instead of 1 resistor. There'll be 4 4-ohm resistors to make this 1-ohm load, and then it won't be as bad. In other words, we're going to use multiple resistors there so it'll dissipate more heat and increase the power handling a little bit more. So we're going to do that on this one, and we'll put a little package together for high quality parts, tube connectors, new wiring, sheet of no-res. We'll do the same for the Klipsch. We'll put together a package with new parts, but again, I'm going to have to design something completely new for this thing. So there you go. There's the kind of a tale of 2 center channels. That's it for this one. I hope you guys enjoyed it. If you did, please hit the subscribe button down at the bottom so you'll get notification of our new videos when they launch. And thank you for watching. We'll see you guys in the next one.